Good morning, YouTubers. It's Rabbi Kolakowski here. I'm going to talk about things that make us uncomfortable. In the meantime, while we're getting ready for this, why don't you hit the like button, the subscribe button, and that little bell notification so you can see every time I post a video, which is quite often, actually. There are certain things that make us uncomfortable politically, religiously, different things like this. And the question is, how do we deal with these things? This was something I was thinking about this morning. We could say it has some connection to this season of Shovavim, where we're reading about the Exodus. And so therefore, we see there's something about slavery. We were slaves in Egypt. Shovavim, although this year's Shovavim Tat, ends off with Mishpatim, which has the halachas of the Eved Ivri. And it's interesting how the Mekubalim say that the laws of the Hebrew indentured servant are essentially the end of Shovavim. That's the tikkun and the full circle, in a sense, of our slavery in Egypt. And what does that mean exactly? So here we're in Parshas Va'era, which is, Parshas Shmos, Parshas Va'era are the main aspects of the slavery aspect, and Va'era begins the Exodus, and is when we actually have the Exodus. For those who don't know what I'm saying, each week in the Jewish liturgy, liturgically speaking, we read part of the Torah. And so each, couple of chapters that we read on a particular week has a name. Generally, it's one of the first words, or one of the first somewhat unique or significant words in that reading of the weekly reading, according to the tradition of a weekly annual cycle of liturgical reading. Every tradition has weekly reading, but the question is it an annual cycle or a triennial cycle? The triennial cycle that's common today in conservative and reform synagogues is not the original triennial cycle, incidentally. Generally, it's actually a little bit bizarre, because you don't have the continual reading. It doesn't go straight through. It's just a little bit of that week's reading, and then the next week a little bit of the next week's reading, and then finally when you come to the following year, then you do you go back again. It's a little bit different. It's not the way that it was in ancient times in the Holy Land, where they had a triennial cycle that actually just went straight through the Torah every 3 years. But the cycle that's common today in most Orthodox circles and some conservative circles is the annual cycle. That's how we have the Torah readings, the names of the parshios. So of Shemos, Va'era, Bo. This week is Va'era, and he appeared, and I appeared. That God said, and I appeared unto Abraham and Isaac with the name Kel Shakai, God Almighty. Ushmi Hashem Nadati Lahem, but my name, the Tetragrammaton, was not made known to them. It didn't mean that they didn't know the name. Obviously, they knew that name. But the question was, did they know the essence of that name? Were they shown? Did they experience the essence of that name? That's what it means. Anyway, so slavery is an issue that is very uncomfortable. Here we read, like I said, we're going to come up to Mishpatim, and after all of this, of the laws of the after we just got out of slavery, then we have laws of slavery. And then in Leviticus, we have the laws of the Canaanite slave, which is really actual slavery. The Hebrew slave was more what we would call an indentured servant. But that being said, excuse me, indentured servitude is probably, in an ideal situation, well regulated, a wonderful way to deal with criminal justice. I mean, that's the Torah's way. Certainly, there's different aspects of criminal justice, whether it's restitution or indentured servitude as a form of restitution, corporal punishment and capital punishment. Those were basically the criminal justice system of ancient Israel. Although there was a temporary holding jail in ancient Israel, or in other aspects of ancient Israel, there were jails that were not necessarily in accordance with Torah ideology. Like how Jeremiah was held in jail and so forth. It was not necessarily following a halachic standard. And certainly the jails that existed outside of the Israelite world, that's a different story, but I'm saying within the Israelite world, there was the jail system, but not the way that we understand today in modern society of the prison system. And the question is, how much does this help people, as opposed to in ancient Israel, the idea of indentured servitude essentially would place people into a home where they would have a positive role model if they lacked that growing up, and learn self-worth and the value of work and things like that. Living with generally someone who's successful, if they're able to afford an indentured servant, things like that. It's actually quite a brilliant and God-given system. That being said, modern prison reform does echo some of that, in that we offer educational opportunities in prison and work. And a lot of the work opportunities are educational as well. That's really the essence of what a lot of modern day prison reform has come about to. It's not just busy work, breaking rocks, but it's actually something that you're going to learn a skill, you're going to learn a trade, and have something that will help you when you get out. Which is definitely positive and along the lines of the biblical idea. Now, that is easy to understand, and in general, a lot of Jewish apologists will point to that whenever anyone brings up slavery, and they will ignore the discomfort that we feel with slavery that really is more manifested in the Canaanite slave as opposed to the Hebrew slave, which is really not a slave, an indentured servant. The Canaanite slave is a slave in the sense that we speak of slavery. Even though the word is the same, Eved means servant, and there's really no difference in Hebrew between a paid servant, indentured servant. A paid worker is different than a servant, though. But there's a difference between the servant and the slave, the indentured servant and the slave, but there's a difference between a worker, poel, and an eved, that's true, which is the servant. But we never speak of ourselves in poalim for God. We're not workers for God. We're servants of God. We're God's slaves in that sense. With all this being said, the issue that I wanted to talk about really was not slavery, as much as, in general, these things that we are uncomfortable with today that were common in the old days, and perhaps certain things that exist today that maybe certainly those of us who are more conservative are uncomfortable with, and perhaps using these lessons as a paradigm for dealing with that. This is a little bit radical, so bear with me and argue with me. I want to hear what you have to say about these issues, because I've noticed there's a certain knee-jerk reaction among the left-wing Orthodox to just adopt whatever is standard in their New York City or California society, and being ignorant of, how that's, in a sense, really a Chilul Hashem. We don't need to necessarily ape the debauchery of the left-wing society, which you would think is essentially liberal, because look, we're open-minded, we're accepting these things that are different and that are out of the norm of what was, at a certain time, and now they become very quickly the norm. But then there's a new orthodoxy that doesn't allow for that for any dissent, and yet certain people, will accept that new orthodoxy, even among Jews who are orthoprax, who keep Shabbos and kosher in their way, whatever it is, and daven in shuls with mechitzas. And yet they are living like this. And they've just traded one orthodoxy for another orthodoxy. And yet the fact is, for those of us who are uncomfortable with these things and not accepting everything that the secular society is throwing at us with open arms, things that are relatively new, well, we have to ask ourselves, how do we approach these things? And I feel that we can learn something from this aspect of Torah, that there are things from our past that even most of us, are uncomfortable with. Even the truth and what we've developed an apologetic system, how to answer these things. How do we deal with slavery, with sacrifices, with things that modern society would not be comfortable with, yet these are part of our Torah, part of our God-given faith, part of our orthodoxy. And so how do we balance these things? So, and the answers are not so simple, but I think we can use these things as a paradigm to try to examine these things. So, meaning, for example, we will answer generally, if we'll take the Moreh Nevuchim approach. I won't even call it a Maimonidean approach, because not everyone even agrees that the Rambam actually wrote the Guide to the Perplexed, or wrote all of it, or so forth. And there's all these different, theories about that. Although it's generally accepted, at least in the mythological sense, that Maimonides wrote the Moreh Nevuchim, the Guide to the Perplexed, but even within Maimonides, there are different views within his own writings, and so it's an interesting subject. But if we take that Maimonidean approach that says as follows, that says God gave us the sacrificial system because it would have been too much of a jump societally to not have sacrifices. And in a certain sense, we are more progressive today that we don't have sacrifices, which sounds strange to us because we're looking for the restoration of the sacrificial cult. And there's different discussions about what does that mean exactly. And of course, there's the Musar approach, which is very appealing to me, to say that, what we're trying to accomplish is a level of spirituality that was missing at a certain point in the history of the sacrificial cult, and we needed to, and the idea of familiarity breeds contempt, and so we needed to have that aspect of separation in order so we can appreciate it. And that's why Gullus is actually compared to the Nida in scripture. She was like a menstruant woman, and those who are familiar with Jewish law know that a wife, when she has her period and then 7 clean days, the husband and wife don't touch, and the rabbis of the Talmud said that was a gift from God, because familiarity breeds contempt, and so therefore, in order to make the relationship stronger, you need to have certain times, even on a monthly schedule, that make life more interesting, and give us time to reflect and think and different things like that, and be mindful and not just be animalistic, things like that. And so, and in a sense, the issues that the prophets had with the sacrificial cult was not with the sacrifices themselves that were commanded at Sinai, but to say that you're not seeing the forest through the trees. Why don't you take a break for a couple thousand years and then see, and then you're going to be so excited, Can you imagine, how excited we're going to feel when the sacrifices are restored? And that's why we're going through this Galus, to remind us that the thing is that we have to go by God's schedule, not by our schedule. And that's one of the issues with Zionism and so forth, is trying to force God's hand instead of just waiting for God, letting go and letting God, like we talked about. Because, we're looking for the restoration, but isn't the time, and so too, we could go back to that Maimonidean approach about slavery, that was just part of society, was slavery in those days, and so it had to be regulated, and so too the sacrifices were regulated. No human sacrifice, very limited animal sacrifice. These type of things, and that approach to worship and so forth, and that it should be worshipful and so forth. All these other issues that we could deal with, and that it gives us, experiences and so forth in our relationship with God. With that being said, there are things that existed in ancient society that don't exist today. That the Torah gave us a path to deal with. And the radical idea that I'm proposing today is that so too, the things that we're uncomfortable with in society, we need to find a Torah approach to dealing with things that we would rather not, we wish they would not exist. And it has to be done in a way that's informed in a Torah way. We have to have the insight into our lives, not to let it just be hefker. That doesn't mean there's going to be a monolithic, unified approach among all Jews, or even among all Orthodox Jews, or even all members of a particular community, which is a very difficult thing to deal with. But part of the issue that I see is that there are people, looking at social media and seeing the way young people think, young people who grew up in some of the most cloistered communities, who are doing something a little bit taboo by being on the internet, on Twitter, on Facebook, and reading. Where's their ideology? Where's their mindset? It's not always a Torah true ideology, and these might be people who are observant and part of the culture in dress and language and so forth, and yet they're not, their ideology is not Torah true. Whether it's ideas about sexuality, politics, Torah, a lot of the issues in this ideology are quite problematic, actually. And so we have to ask ourselves, so what is the right way to approach these things? How do we approach these issues? And sometimes they have to be radically different than the way secular society approaches them. We have to be educated enough and open-minded enough to understand that things are not black and white in any sense. And quite often we find ourselves introduced assuming that just certain aspects of the secular culture and ideology, that's just the way it is, when the Torah teaches us that's not the way it is. And maybe just living in this society, we come to conclusions, which even if you wind up learning about what different views are, it gets confusing. I saw a tweet this morning. I wasn't even thinking about this, but then I realized this is really, the crux of the issue that I want to bring out here. It's like, to talk about, the left wants us to believe that sex and sexuality and gender and so forth are fluid, and yet they also want us to believe that people are born with a certain sexual orientation. And so what is it? Is it fluid or is it hardwired? The answer is it could be a little bit of both. It could depend on the individual. But the thing is that really, I mean, this is probably one of the most controversial things that people just can't wrap their minds around. But if you study the Torah viewpoint on these things, there is no such thing in Torah as what we call in the modern Western American society sexual orientation. Homosexuality and heterosexuality are actions and not states of being. There is no such thing as a gay person, and there's no such thing as a straight person. There's just people. And there are acts, and some acts are sinful, and the only sexual act that's not sinful, really, in any sense, is between a husband and a wife with the laws of family purity, which means, you know, the use of the mikveh. And everything else is sinful. It doesn't mean people don't engage in other actions. And there are different levels of sin. Not every sin is a capital sin. And what does sin mean? We don't have a Christian ideology of sin. We have a uniquely Jewish ideology of sin, which is still in certain ways similar to the Christian ideology of sin. That's the, you know, when you say something like that the Jewish idea of sin is different than the Christian idea of sin, it doesn't mean that it's totally radically different, that there's no similarity. And also, you know, the ideas of heaven and hell are different in Judaism than they are in Christianity. And again, a lot of our societal views are colored by that, and that's one issue that, you know, we have to educate our children about, you know, because their ideas are often coming from the street, from the internet, from the society, as opposed to, and it wouldn't even cross their mind that there's anything different, that there is a different idea. And so these are issues that we have to deal with, and you know, so the question is, how do we deal with pluralism? You know, the fact of the matter is, the Reform and the Conservative are not going away. Do we just ignore them? Do we have a certain type of interaction with them? Other religions, they're not going anywhere. How do we interact with them? How did our Gedolim in the past interact with other religions, and how does that perhaps color how we should perhaps interact with other movements of Jews that are outside of the realms of what we consider to be Judaism? And yet we might or might not consider some of these people to be, in some level or form, to be Jews. Again, what is a Jew? Who is a Jew? What does it mean to be Jewish? You know, and why is that important? How to deal with Zionism, how to deal with all these different issues that, with certain things, you know, and how did the Tanaim and Amoraim deal with heretical groups? You know, these are the types of questions that we have to answer ourselves, and they're not easy. But we should make sure that we're informed from a Torah perspective and not from a secular Western perspective. God bless. Please like, share, subscribe, comment, take care.